microphone. Hey guys, so we're here chatting about some whiskey sours. Basically, we wanted to have a little sit down. There's an instructional video that's come out on this whiskey sour. It's a very specific one. We wanted to have just like a nice sort of like round table discussion about how we feel about whiskey, how we feel about the cocktail. Basically, just wanted it to be like what you do with your friends. You sit down, you've all ordered the same cocktail, you talk about what you like about it, you know, you shoot the shit. Let's just kind of bring that into sort of the virtual world. So just brief introductions if nobody knows. My name's Tom. I was a bartender for about 10 years, and then I went into brand work, and I've been working with whiskey in one shape or another for probably like the last 3.5 years. And yeah, glad to be here. Everyone else?
Nice uncomfortable silence. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, we're going that. Hi, I'm Will. I'm currently still a bartender, so I'm the bar manager at a small little cocktail bar down in Brighton. So about kind of 45 capacity, so a small but high volume that we get those turn-throughs. I have also had the pleasure of working with Elaine before. We worked together, 2, 3, no, longer. 4 years we worked together. Mm-hmm. Scary time. So we worked together for a while, and yeah, so still bartending. Been bartending about 10 years, and yeah, still loving it. Been drinking a lot of whiskey in that time. Even managed a whole whiskey bar out in Malta, so that was fun times. We can talk about that in a bit. So yeah, and then on to Larkin.
I'm Elaine. I look after some brands as well, so I look after spirits mostly. I was bartender for about 12 years before I moved into brand work, and as Will said, I've worked with him both in Malta and in Brighton. Just still part of the bartending community by selling them booze.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. We've all kind of got a little bit of a link as well, because I used to work for the same company that Elaine works for as well. So we've got some sort of kind of shared professional history as well. So it's a perfect sort of group forum. But like I say, the first thing that we want to do, while we've got it here fresh, we've made these cocktails just prior to starting the video. So, yep. Glasses up, everyone. Cheers. A little bit of a virtual cheers. And just let's have a try and see what we think.
Well, that is
good.
Whiskey.
Nice job, Will.
Nice job. Very nice job. Very nice job. So just for clarity's sake, what we're trying here now is a whiskey sour, but with the addition of some homemade orgeat. So wanted to maybe highlight how you can make some of these simple cocktails just like a little bit more exciting by introducing some homemade ingredients. But I gotta say right off the bat, it's really tasty. Like the nuttiness works well with the sort of dryness of the whiskey. I was a little bit worried that maybe the syrup was a little thinner than your sort of typical 2-2 cane syrup that you might put into like a regular sour, but like the body is right there.
So that's what I found. Like so working with different syrups, I found that when we're like a nice 2-to-1 sugar syrup works beautifully in whiskey sours, and you can like bump that volume down just a little bit. You still get the sweetness, but you still get that much bigger whiskey hit. Whereas if we're doing, I found with milk syrups, like a 1-to-1 works slightly better. So things like with an orgeat or even like a coconut syrup, it works better. Having it a 1-to-1, a little bit thinner, kind of pushes the whiskey to that forefront, because although you're getting the sweetness from the sugar, you're also getting that sweetness from the milk itself. So the same way that like that's those fats that are built up in that milk really helps push that sweetness. So I think a 1-to-1 works a little bit better on it. And also with the orgeat, I think kind of helps to bring out that sort of like that dryness that you do get from a rye whiskey that you ordinarily wouldn't get from something like a Scotch or in the same way from a bourbon, because you've got that sweetness in the bourbon. That rye just has that spiciness that works quite nice with that orgeat.
I made the orgeat slightly differently because I didn't have any almond milk in the house, but I did have almond flour.
Nice.
So I went back to very simple syrup, but with almond flour. So I had 100 ml of water, 100 grams of sugar, and then I put in 2 large tablespoons of the almond flour and boiled that up. So I'd be really interested to try what the difference our drinks have come out with, me using a different type of syrup to what you've used.
Yeah.
We've got some differences.
Yeah, I mean, like I can imagine, like off the bat, you have like a slightly textural difference, because I'm imagining it's going to be a bit with that flour. It's going to add a little bit more starchiness to it, a little bit thicker mouthfeel, which is kind of that element that you do always forget about drinks, especially the sour. And that's why I think having like an egg white in there does work nicely, because it gives that nice velvety texture that you expect. Whereas like a whiskey sour without an egg white, or even without like aquafaba or miracle foamer is great. It's still a completely different drink. And I think I've always struggled like trying to explain that across the bar to people. I'm sure you guys must have come across that in your bartending careers, where people be like, oh, egg white, gross.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's probably like the most explained concept behind any bar is egg whites. Is, you know, it doesn't really have any flavor, it's just a protein. It does have a smell, which is what's really important about like effervescing oil over the top of a drink if you use an egg, because, you know, you leave it there for 5 minutes, you get that kind of weird little sort of like almost like sort of wet dog smell, which sounds horrible, but it's true. But like, you know, that's it. And I think that's like maybe like, especially if we're talking about making cocktails at home, we always see like bartenders being fancy and effervescing oils over the top. We assume that it's probably just a little wanky, but it's totally not. It actually adds like a real sort of odor to the drink, and it cancels out the smell of some of the off notes if you are using egg white as well. So yeah, I mean, I've actually opted for, I've got Mrs. Better's in mine. I don't know whether both of you guys used egg. I like Mrs. Better's. I had it on hand. I knew you guys would probably be using egg, so I wanted to try something a little bit different. But it's got a colour difference, and it's got like a mild flavour difference. So, like you say, it is a totally different drink.
But although I do find like, I don't want to kind of brand call too much on this, but I do really like the Mrs. Better's for that, is the fact that it does, whenever I've used it, it does still give it gives the foam, although a little bit smaller, but it also gives a dryness that you don't get from other foamers that I've worked with. And even using like aquafaba, like it's great, you get a much bigger foam and it's like much headier, but it doesn't add the dryness to the drink that you get from the Mrs. Better's bitters, which is more similar to an egg white, I would say. And also means like I've always found that you can just knock down the amount of like Angostura or whatever else you're putting in there to kind of balance against that little bitterness it gives.
Yeah, for sure.
I find sorry.
Oh no, Elaine, go, because I was going to say, Elaine, me and Will are very much enthusiasts of the up sour as well. Like, I mean, it's something that I've probably for quite a few years now I haven't had a sour on the rocks. I like the consistency of it, that it doesn't dilute. But is it something that you usually go for a down like on the rock sour sort of thing? I'm
really happy with either, to be honest. I just thought I'd treat myself to some ice because I made some yesterday. My ice is hilarious at the moment because I've literally just frozen a baking tray full of water and then very brutally just smashed it. I didn't even cut it, I just smashed it. I've done exactly the same thing. It brings it, makes it rustic. It looks good. A big shard of ice, and no matter what, looks good in a glass of whiskey, which has kind of been my primary thing. Just on the homemade ingredients, this is the Orgier. It's not the prettiest of ingredients. We were talking about, we've obviously made it. It was all relatively simple. I think one thing that I wanted to maybe say is I did a second batch, and which was chili, lime, a little bit of rose as well, and a little bit of vanilla. Probably what's cool about homemade ingredients and especially homemade syrups is like the versatility. If you just like flavors, you can just kind of get any flavor augmented in there. I know, Will, you were suggesting orange blossom, but is there anything else that you'd put into a syrup that you quite like that changes the flavor of it a little bit?
I would say, I'll tell you what, actually there's one thing that we got into over the summer at the bar last year. So kind of made a move to making kind of fresh syrups. I was like, well, we're getting some really good produce in at the moment. So we're getting some great pineapples, some great raspberries, even some strawberries towards like the beginning of the summer, and found what was it? It was in Stuart's Guide and Fancy Drinks, which is like a cocktail book from like 1880, I think. Like it's a real old one, and there's syrup recipes in there galore. And to be fair, these are the ones I'm following most of the time. They still stand up to the test of time. But the one thing that I found with the fresh fruit syrups is doing them, and for about a litres worth of syrup, adding about 25 ml of Rare Nephew in there. Like, man, it just boosts it. Like, it elongates the flavour a little bit longer, and it really, like, you don't taste Rare Nephew because that's a pretty pokey flavour. We can all agree that we've all got some fairly bad memories associated with it, and some pretty good ones,
or the lack thereof.
But it's just like it's kind of like, so you know when like it's kind of like bartender's MSG. Like you just chuck a little bit in, and it just boosts the flavour. It's got so many esters in there because like that funky pot still rum that it just bursts.
Well, the high
really
ABV with Ray and Nephew kind of brings a bit more punch to a drink as well. Just having that little bit higher ABV just pulls the flavors out a little bit sometimes too.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I don't know about you guys, I have a little bit of a tendency with cocktails, especially stirred down stuff. Well, actually, to be honest, anything, I do lean towards proof. So kind of 50% and above. It just means that you've got usually a lot more flavor. I mean, like, I'm not putting down, I represent obviously a lot of, spirits that aren't proof and things like that, but when you're at that level and you're stirring something down, it just seems like the margin for error is a lot larger. I don't know the way you put it, but there's less room for error because you're playing with that ABV. It's always going to have like a pretty big flavour to it, and it's always going to be delicious. So if you're using something that's like a barrel proof whiskey in an old fashioned, you can stir that for a really long time, and your sort of target spectrum for where you want to be on that cocktail is always going to be pretty wide, and you're also going to be able to make some some better decisions with the dilution. So that's really nice.
So would you generally look for something that's 50% ABV, 100% proof?
In my personal drinking time, yeah, for sure. Like I get excited when there's cowboy whiskey, I think it is. It's called. It's a whiskey out of Texas. There's some great whiskeys out of Texas, but I think it's called Cowboy Bourbon or Cowboy Whiskey, and they just released some insane, like an 135 proof thing, and like that just excites me. Like I get so I am excited by higher proof. Maybe that's just because I spent 13 years killing every single taste bud in my mouth.
135, that's what, 62.5 ABV?
No, I think it was like 60, 67, 68, something like that.
Yeah, my math is terrible.
No, well, don't worry. I mean, like I read the article. I'm sure I'm still wrong. But no, that for me, that was, I like to say there's some big ones out there for me. I mean, Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. There's a company that both me and Elaine used to work for.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, even coming to higher proof. I know we're not talking about this spirit at the moment. We're kind of focusing on whiskey, but I've now kind of like in recent years like opted to using like a Navy strength if I'm going for martinis, especially dirty martinis. Like a Navy strength dirty martini any day of the week. Like just that brine and that ABV. Yeah. And like you say, like because the difference between like 40% and say 38, even down to 36, like you don't taste it that much. But then when you get down to like 20 to 18, you taste it and it tastes thin, which is so having like that extra like 15% on yeah, it's about 15% on Plymouth really helps.
So you just did that.
Yeah, so anyway, so you were saying that both you guys have opted to go for the filling the baking trays and chucking them in the freezer option, which I think is a great. You do get that sort of like that sexy big ice that you can carve up, and also you do like if you got the time, you can get that nice directional freezing on it, which obviously Brighton with the hardest water known to man does help. Our trend of using like big things of ice and like freezing ice in like baking trays and gastro trays came from there, and that was more of a necessity than anything else. because there wasn't enough money to set up a bar, and he couldn't afford an ice machine. But a chest freezer came with the premises, so it's literally just like fuck it, like put it in there, freeze it, we've got ice. So that was which I thought was like a really cool thing. So
when I did the pop-up 2 years ago for Christmas, 3 years ago, we had no money behind us, so all of our ice was just baking tray ice.
Yeah, which I think is great. I think it's definitely something that you can experiment more with at home. You've got like, even if it's not a baking tray, or if it's like some old Tupperware, you can just chuck that into the freezer, get that, and just like start smashing around with it, carving up some ice.
Saves you going to the shop during the lockdown.
I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's something that, I mean, in our circles, I'm sure it gets spoken about a lot, but ice is the ubiquitous ingredient in all cocktails, right? Like, bar very few, and having good ice is so important. It's not something that's massively, I guess, embraced in Western bartending, but for sure in places like Japan. I mean, I don't think ice machines are very commonplace over there. They have ice men that come around. They have different types of ice for different cocktails, and there is a huge fucking difference. So, the ice that I was using today, obviously I've served it up, so the ice is not important in the sort of drinking part of it, but using those bigger, really cold pieces of ice when you're shaking as well, it's exactly the same as when we were talking about ABV. You're completely playing with your margin for error, because the dilution's going to be lower, and that ice is harder and denser. So you're going to get less chips kind of coming off the ice, and those larger bits going to melt slower. So you can shake for a lot longer without having because over shaking a drink you can't come back from there. I mean, nobody's opening up a shaker, pouring more whiskey, pouring a bit more of ethylene in there. It's not like a pasta sauce.
That doesn't work.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Like, everyone's done it once because they were busy and they can't be fucked to make another one. Yeah. But it doesn't. It doesn't work.
It definitely works at that point.
Well, yeah. If
when
you want to
three deep at the bar,
you just want to get out. But no, those big chunks of ice, they don't have to be huge, but bigger than the ones you get out of Hoshisaki's, obviously.
Even for drinks that aren't served over ice, having the right ice to stir down with can be quite important too.
Huge thing. Stirring, you're looking at, trying to find the exact moment when it's perfect. That's it. There's no this drink is 20. I mean, I know a lot of people say old fashioned 60 revolutions or whatever like that, it's really,
that's going to depend on your ice.
It's going to depend on the ice more than anything. Yeah. And having good ice and just crushing that, making your own is the best way of doing that. The stuff from the shop, it's hollow, it melts a lot quicker than you think. It's kind of got that weird crystalline thing on the outside. You'd be surprised how much water that actually is. So you end up with quite a watery drink. If it's not coming out of a professional ice machine at a bar, it might not be great. But if you're making your own, it's really good. It's really good stuff. So I guess it would be important to just be like, what's our actual? Would we order this in a bar? Like, is this something do you like? I
think I enjoyed mine.
I was going to say,
let's pretend that we all haven't definitely tried that, and Will's not garnishing it with a side of whiskey as well.
Yeah, I love that the wheels are getting a bit more greased as well. It's just like it's what I love about like when you do whiskey tastings. Like everyone at the beginning's a little reticent, and by the end, everyone's like it's like proper happy juice. Everyone's just like bang into it. But no, I mean, like, look, I don't really to say I don't order sours is stupid, because sours are like. So many classics. I order a margarita. Margarita's a sour. I'll order, someone will kill me for saying this, but like a white lady or something,
I love a white lady.
So these things, so they do permeate. But I will say, I do like the idea. It has refreshed some interest in me for having a sour, just having like just one thing changed. Whether it's, and I think the syrup is probably the thing that you can fuck with the most. Are there any other syrups that you guys like to make? I mean, vanilla syrups obviously out there. Chili. Anything.
Actually,
is there any that you're interested in?
Like vanilla syrups, obviously, like that's. I think if you're just getting into bartending, especially like home bartending, I think having vanilla syrup is a really good thing to have. Just because if you're really keen on it, and your skill levels like your interest here and your skill levels are here, having vanilla syrup for a while kind of helps to boost it. It's kind of like, because everyone loves vanilla. Like everyone's like, oh, vanilla flavored, but like vanilla syrup just helps to kind of wash over a lot of unbalanced sins that you might get if you're home bartending. So I think if you're home bartending, having vanilla syrup is great because it's just an easier thing to get into. And especially if you're doing something like an old fashioned, you can stir down a little bit of that. And like you say, like we're always talking about, like, you know, I want barrel proof, I want Navy strength, I want like 60% ABV and above, and we'll handle that like any day of the week. But if you haven't been drinking for 10 years, like 60, like 40% is burning you. So having like something easy to get into in that respect, I think vanilla is great. In terms of other syrups to kind of use on with whiskey sours, like I actually just before we all kind of went into lockdown, was starting to use we're starting to kind of play around with the idea of using raspberry and like kind of fresh raspberries with rye. And it's on paper you're just like, oh, kind of like a clover club but with rye. It makes sense, but it ended up tasting quite vinegary, which didn't work, which was a shame because it would have been great because we were just doing like a whole series of drinks. In terms of like other syrups to kind of like to have around, I think this was one of yours, Elaine, actually.
Oh, yeah.
From the first, so it's actually, we never worked together. It was my first time in Brighton. It was with Makers. You're using, I think, was it?
That was the Jesse James.
Yeah.
So that was the link there was that in the house at Maker's Mark they have one of Jesse James's guns. So I named it after him. But yeah, so I all I did for that was it was for a competition and we were only allowed to change out one ingredient and add one ingredient. So I swapped the regular sugar for passion fruit syrup and then I shook it with fresh mint leaves.
That's what it was.
Yeah, so
passion fruit worked quite nicely with the whiskey.
Juice, peach bitters, passion fruit syrup and fresh mint leaves. Really simple. Nice. Egg white as well. But yeah, really simple. Yeah. Really long finish on it as well.
I want to ask a kind of cheeky question because you've touched on something there that I always find quite funny, which is peach bitters. Peach bitters for me is like the ultimate fuck up ingredient.
Chicken stock.
And I'm sure, mate, that's it. It's 100%. Dude, have you ever had someone say to you, surprise me with something, and you're completely put on the spot, and then you're just knocking something together, and then you get to the end, you're like, this doesn't taste great, but you know what does taste great? Peach bitters. Well, I'm just gonna we'll knock that out. We'll palm it off, and that's fine. Are there any other ingredients that you've done that you do that with? Peach bitters for me is might be the Mac Daddy on that one, but
to be fair, passion fruit.
This is bad. Customers shouldn't know this, but yeah, for sure.
It's there. So like I've always found that like with rhubarb bitters as well, just like bad.
Rhubarb's a great flavor. Yeah, a little acidity, just like done.
And then like if you've shaken a drink and you're serving it long, it's come up short. It's like, oh shit, like wash line should be higher. Just turning around like ginger ale. And then it's like, he was like, oh, that's a nice spicy. Like, yep.
I tell you what, maybe what's important to take from that, anyone, is that nobody's perfect. So, you know, cock-ups happen in professional kitchens, professional bars.
Well, the thing is, like, I've suddenly realised you guys are out of the bar work, but, like, if this actually works and, like, and people watch this, they come in and see me, they're like, oh, ginger ale, I see. Like,
see you using that peach fizz. That's it. It's game over. It's game over. Oh, that's hilarious. I guess something we touched on very, very quickly there was the use of, this is a whiskey kind of focused video, I guess, is using rye. This is obviously a rye whiskey cocktail. I hope we've mentioned that at this point.
It's a lot 40, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think we have.
It's fine. But for sure, different styles of whiskey in different cocktails. I think there's an oversimplification And I understand the need for that oversimplification because not everyone knows a lot about whiskey. But there's an oversimplification of like rye is going to work with these drinks and corn whiskey is going to work with these drinks and malt whiskey is going to work with these drinks. There's some truth in that. But if you start trying these amazing rye whiskeys that are coming out of everywhere and these amazing corn whiskeys that are coming out of everywhere, you start to realize that the flavor difference is unbelievable. So, you know, when you're talking about rye working particularly well in a clover club, it's because sometimes rye has that really what its most common flavor is known as, because rye is a grass, rye is a true grass, is that sort of like dry hay-like sort of astringency sort of flavor that people really love, and like Manhattan and things like that, that's playing off these like kind of sweet cherry notes from vermouth. And maybe corn, you'd say corn's going to be buttery and rich and maybe even a little bit tropical or whatever. So that's going to work well in something probably more like a sour, you know. But I don't know whether there's that much truth in that, because for me, rye at a certain ABV, especially the lower ABVs, has a really fruity note to its flavor spectrum. And corn whiskey, for example, if you're going on something like Balcones or something, which is another Texas distillery, would you believe it? You know, when they're using blue corn and that aging is really intense, you're going to come away with something kind of like those burnt caramel flavors, which isn't something you get in loads of corn whiskeys or you know, or just grain whiskeys in general. So I think it is important to say, play around with this stuff. Rye whiskey does work in some cocktails just because it works in those cocktails. But if you're playing with different rye whiskeys, different corn whiskeys and things like that, I think it's super important to play with your recipes as well, you know. Almost like you're using different meat in a dish.
Yeah, well, I think like we kind of touched on this sort of like culinary thing. Like I think still, so we can really sort of like say like this modern age of bartending kind of started like 99, 2000. So we've only really been going for the last 20 years of like true sort of like high-end cocktail making, and it's really kind of been progressing. And like, well, we say that, but then we've got a lot more sort of like accessible technology to us that you wouldn't have had 20 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. The technology is.
I think to have those sort of set rules is kind of like looking back at like classic. If you look back at classic cooking, it's like this should work and this should work and this should work and these are these dishes. But then you start to get like fusion food that came through, and people say, "Oh my god!" So like kind of like Asian flavors and Italian flavors work really well together. And I think that's true. But I'll tell you, if you think about like whiskey drinks where you're like initially, well, no, rye should work here. It's now getting to the point where you can start to play around with it, and people are kind of breaking those barriers down. And especially with Scotch whiskey, I found like a lot of people are now happier to put that into a cocktail. Whereas even 10 years ago when I first started, people were like, "Oh, Scotch whiskey in a cocktail." Oh, I don't know. And you say it works. So I think it's come a long way.
Yeah,
I think that was kind of like a starting point that didn't really go anywhere.
Yeah, basically this will be a little bit of a plug, because this is something that I'm working on writing about for Drink With Us as well, actually, is the concept of third wave bartending. This was something that was outlined for me by a bartender when I wasn't really that into it. I was getting into bartending, I was getting into whiskey and all those things, but I was in a completely different city. And when he told me about it, I thought it must be a subject that everyone knows about. But in subsequent research, I've just found that there's really nothing written about it. So, you know, maybe it's something he came up with or someone he knows came up with. But essentially, the sort of nucleus of the idea is that we are now in the third wave of bartending. And I love the fact that we have a profession that has such a rich history as well, and such a rich future for that matter, because, I mean, let's face it, in the apocalypse there's still going to be people making booze. The idea is that you have first, second, and third wave bartending. Third is what we're in. First is really your Jerry Thomases, you know, your classics, something we're still feeding off today. Second wave is maybe like the one that's probably seen as the worst, but you've still seen some amazing stuff come out of it. Second wave was really like that sort of cocktail party. Everything has to have a really sexual name. It's a slow, comfortable screw up against a wall or something, you know. It's, you know, when it was all kind of poppy and you know, I guess there was a lot of sort of like nouveau riche stuff going on at that time, and it was seen as like fancy. But then you've also got like, you know, Salvador Calabrese coming up with like, you know, the Diamond Martini in that phase and everything like that. And now this third wave of bartending, as Will so astutely noted upon, is, you know, based on this like technological development, this real attention to detail and nuance. Extreme focus on the spirits and the knowledge of those spirits, things like digging, you know, for vintages and things in your dusty shops and things like that, and generally just, you know, trying to go back to basics, you know, things like perfecting the old fashioned, you know, things like that. It's a bit of a nebulous concept about it. I'm hoping that I can put it down on paper in an effective way. But yeah, that is something that I'm very interested in, and I've also got a very close eye on what that next step is going to be as well, what that fourth wave bartending is going to be, and I'm really excited to see some of the younger guys coming up now doing just crazy stuff. But you know, what that's actually going to turn into eventually is going to be, you know, really exciting.
Yeah, third wave bartending. So you're saying about this, and I think the next stage is already being realised, and it's already kind of been bubbling away for a little while. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this lockdown does affect this, because it's something that has been bubbling away, and I think this is going to help to boost it, just help to kind of rocket that forward. Is the first sort of like real celebrity bartender, if you will. So if you think back, like you can name like, you know, like easily like 5-10 different celebrity chefs, but if you were to say the name like Dick Bradstall outside sort of bar circles, or even Jerry Thomas, or like Tony C, or like Calabrese, or whoever, people kind of stare at you a bit blankly and be like, who? Whereas like other bartenders will be like, oh, yeah, no, I know who you're talking about. They did this. And obviously, I think like the most important in our time is Dick Bradstall with the cocktails that he's done. So I think the rise of the first true celebrity bartender that's recognised outside of the industry is coming. And I genuinely think that person's going to be Ryan. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly.
Chetty Yawadana.
Yeah.
Ryan Chetty Yawadana, I think.
Ryan Chetty. Because
Ryan
I mean, like, he's
Ryan Chetty.
He's been doing it. Like he's basically been at the forefront of what bartending has been and what it's been pushing forward into for years. I know I first met him in 2012. He was actually judging a cocktail comp, which genuinely was the most terrifying experience of my life. So it's 2012. So I've been bartending maybe a year and a half, 2 years. I was in an international final. I was at Bramble in Edinburgh, and in front of me I had Ryan Chetty, I had Simon Difford, I had I can't remember her name, but she's basically to gin what Ian Burrell is to rum, and Ian Karisky, who was the BA for the gin at the time. And it was genuinely like a terrifying experience to be like, all these people know so much more than me. But like, the guy's really nice. But I think that's the rise of the celebrity bartender is coming. And it'll be interesting to see how this lockdown and how bartenders now that be kind of like touching on the social media side of things, but never really having time, because, you know, working bars, you work like 10, 12 hours a day, and you just don't have time for that many hobbies. Whereas this is some downtime for people. And I think that's going to come. I think there's also the batch cocktail and the pre-batch cocktail, and having that bottled cocktail is gonna come back again. Like, it's already been around. Like the tiki era, you used to get like tiki mixes. You can get, you know, Jeff's tiki mix, just add rum and you add it, and that's been kind of like on the. We've seen a bit more of that sort of like RTDs in recent times, where I think last Christmas some of the supermarkets were putting out like kegs of porn style martinis or espresso martinis. But I think that craft RTD is just is going to break soon because the access.
RTD being to drink.
Yeah, so ready to drink. So you've seen this a lot with kind of like your G&Ts and your cows, like G&T, like little Pims. But I think the RTD cocktail is, and like especially the RTD craft cocktail, is going to take off in the next couple of years. I think it's just going to be that big thing that you can just push out. It's going to be, and I think the guys at Tay and Elemental are kind of touching on this as well, where it's a bar, but it's not just a bar. Like it's more like a front for everything else that they're doing. I mean, like, correct me if I'm wrong. Like, I still haven't been up there, but this, like, from what I've been reading about them and like speaking to guys that've been there, that kind of seems what they're doing, and that's kind of like the forefront to push this out. So, like this sort of like this zeitgeist that you can buy, you can keep, that you don't need to go there for.
Yeah, I mean, I've been there. I had a very brief experience of it, but yeah, you go in there for like the sort of bottomless coffees, and they've got these kind of very brief food sort of cocktail menu affair, but then you go back and they've got people making spirits for them, and they're being very sort of deliberate about the things that they put out and things like that. It would be really interesting to actually maybe have a conversation with one of those guys and see about that changing face of things. We're for sure seeing bartending change in a big way. Obviously that happened kind of huge in that sort of craft spirits boom as well, sort of early 2000s, mid 2000s, and yeah, I mean, all of these things. One thing that I find really interesting is kind of like the whole kind of fashion's never finished sort of concept. Definitely there was that the first part of that movement was very focused on, the first wave of bartending was very much focused on classics, twisting classics, how we're going to make these things sort of like more fun, more exciting, things like that, and how we can perfect them in different ways, how we can bring them into a modern era. But what I found as time has gone on is there's been a lot more pulling on inspiration from the second wave of bartending, which was, like we say, that kind of like more poppy, sort of like trashy, I guess, sort of divey kind of experience. You got guys like Jake doing Cease and Desist in Brighton, Jake Goldstein, and he's making these really well thought out, really amazing drinks, but he's approaching it in a very non-pretentious sort of way, and that feels like a development in a big way, that we're doing this complicated sort of craft, but approaching it with like a sort of joviality that's really nice. That did seem to be missing for a little bit there. It did get very serious for a moment almost, and it almost got a little bit stuffy. And I think that's because it was kind of drawing on this sort of like old style of drink making, whereas now we're drawing on that second wave. It's a little bit more fun, it's a little bit more sort of accessible for customers as well. I think they're really enjoying it as well. I mean, what's great bartenders both are able to create these amazing drinks that can engage bartenders in a really great way, but then also capture the imagination of the customer as well. So,
speaking of the customer, Will mentioned Dick Bradsell earlier on. I mean, a lot of people outside of the industry won't know him, but everybody's heard of a Bramble and everybody's heard of an espresso martini, and they're two of his
drinks.
Yeah.
That's
why I say, like, I think this is the next wave is going to see that rise of the celebrity bartender, where you're like, oh, bam, like it's so and so with such and such, because it's kind of going that way, where now with this, like you're saying, like that sort of first wave and that second wave, you can start to pinpoint drinks to certain bartenders, rather than like kind of lost to the annals of history, where it's just, you can say, like, oh no, this person created this drink at this time in this bar, and therefore like it's an easier lineage to trace. I guess the same point is the bartender's still quite important and quite an integral role. And it was demonstrated with the guys at the Artisan when they left the Artisan, and it went from number one to not number one. And that's purely the bartender rather than in the institute. So I think there is starting to be a bit more of a shift in that sense of like the celebrity bartender, the personality, the person rather than the bar and the role. That makes sense.
Okay, so we're going to just have a little talk about whiskey. I know that we talk about whiskey quite sort of specifically. We know a lot about it between us, I guess, working with it, drinking plenty of it, and generally having an active interest in news around it and things like that. So it can be quite easy for us to kind of forget that maybe whiskey can be an alien concept to some people. When we're talking about whiskey, in the simplest term, we're talking about aged grain spirit. Now, depending on where it's coming from, will depend massively how the flavor is. Also, what it is made from will affect how it tastes as well. You'll see a lot of different definitions for different whiskey. You'll have Scotch, obviously, which just means that it's coming from Scotland, essentially. Generally, that will be made with malt. You'll have Irish whiskey. Irish whiskey, again, it's simple. It's coming from Ireland. It will really, everyone has their own rules, but generally you'll be using malted and unmalted barley. These are concepts that you can read up on if you like. Really just take it as it's going to taste a little bit different. There will be some other grains, corn usually. Then you'll have American whiskey, which has a lot of similarities to Canadian whiskey. We won't go into too specifically about that, where generally you'll be using a mixture of corn, rye and barley in that mixture. But then you also have 100% rye whiskies and whiskies that are rye forward, that generally you'll call rye whiskey. You'll have corn forward whiskies or corn whiskies that generally have a high percentage of corn in them. They'll really all be aged over 3 years, and most of the time, unless it's a very specific whiskey, it will be aged in oak. So a really interesting way to think about whiskey is it is essentially an oak flavored spirit made from grain. So if you on the most basic of levels think about whiskey as an oak flavored spirit that is made from grains, usually corn, rye or malt, then you're on a good path to understanding it, and anything more specific from there you can go into. Today we were using a rye whiskey.
This was 100% rye whiskey, which means that we were only using rye grains to produce the pure spirit. We were then taking that spirit and we were aging it for a certain period of time in oak. And that's where it gets its color from. And that's where it gets some of the flavor from. Some of the flavor will come from that rye. Rye generally, if we're talking very generally, will be drier, spicier. But as we may cover, it can taste a lot of different ways. Corn will be generally sweeter, a little bit more buttery. Malt might be a little bit more earthy. It's a good way to think about it if you want to understand grains, is think about it in terms of bread. How does rye bread taste? How does wheat bread taste? How does does cornbread taste that you'd have with like your barbecue and things like that? These are all basic concepts that you can start to build into your mind to start to understand whiskey a little bit better. So yeah, that as a absolute base concept, we're talking a little bit about whiskey now, basically. So I don't know. We all, like I say, have had some experience with it, or a lot of experience. So what really has been your approach to whiskey, I guess, guys? Maybe Elaine, starting off with you. How long have you been interested in it? Where does it sit in, your favorites, like sort of spirits and things like that?
So I think I was, as a young adult, I believed that I did not like the taste of whiskey at all. But I grew up in Ireland, so I'd only really had cheap Irish whiskey at that point because I was quite young. And it wasn't until I was introduced to Islay malts, which are the peated malts from the island of Islay off the coast of Scotland. And I got all this smoke flavour, and that's what turned me onto whiskey originally. From the back of that, I started to open my mind a little bit and start to try different categories, and then discovered things like bourbon and rye whiskey. So that's American and Canadian whiskies, which funnily enough, I find a little bit closer to Irish whiskey than to Scotch in their flavour profile. But then going full circle, that brings me back to finding good Irish whiskies as well. So I think for me, my palate is quite happy with most whiskey categories. And then within those categories, I have favorites, but I'm not gonna tell you guys what my favorites are, because I think you should find your own. But yeah, so from a cocktail point of view, I mean, I quite like to play with a classic sour, but put a peated whiskey in that, and some like berry flavors with that. I find the smoke and the berries works really well together. And then if I want something sort of just, a nice relaxing evening I will go for a Manhattan, and I will usually go for a sweet Manhattan, which would be, for me, I would go with rye, sweet vermouth, a little bit of Angostura bitters, and a cherry garnish. Just nice and clean and simple. Yeah.
And Will?
So my relationship. So when I first started bartending, like when I was early 20s, and the first whiskey that I really got into, kind of bar what my parents would drink at home, was surprisingly it was the Avalor or Avalauer, Abunda. So this is this is the cask strength version of the whiskey, and I think it was using it in cocktails, in the fact that because it's so high, it's really nice to work with, where your margin of error is much bigger. So you can afford to take bigger risks with it, because you're like, well, it's all like that area that I'm hitting is a bigger area to get into. So I don't have to be as precise, but I can still make a great drink. And you do. So when we did that, so that's where I kind of first started, and then obviously moving into Malta, I got the chance to. This was where I had a small whiskey knowledge, and this is, I'd say, where it within about 2 years, like, I had to learn fast about a lot of whiskies. So I took over the bar, and we had, I think, 130 whiskies, and I was asked to redo the whiskey list and the cocktail menu, and I took it from 130 to 190 with about a 5 by the bottle changing rotation, and that was a lot to kind of learn and take on board, because my Scottish whiskey knowledge was good, but this was around 2013, 2014. So many of you might know that 2014, Jim Murray, if you forgot his name there, Jim Murray announced the Yamazaki as the best whiskey in the world. It's a Japanese whiskey, and suddenly, like, the world, like the world whiskey stage just opened up, and we're in this tiny island where Scotch has got like a big grounding. So we would sell in a weekend, like a quiet weekend, we would get through maybe 12 bottles of Johnny Walker Black, and that's not even our base whiskey. Like we're just, that was just like the upgrade, just splashing through all that. And then suddenly this island where you've got like less than a million people suddenly wanting like world whiskeys, and this is where we had to try and like track down some of these, and like trying to get it in, because people wanted it. So kind of like, so then my exploration to world whiskeys kind of really took off. So that's where I actually fell in love with my favourite whiskey still. I believe you guys have a little sample to have a little try on that. But then it was trying to learn about kind of that, and then also kind of keeping up with American whiskies, because at the time I was sort of like, okay, like bourbons and American whiskies, I'm going to have them, I'm going to use them in cocktails. And then it wasn't until a little bit later I was like, actually, well, I've got great Scottish whiskey I'm using there. But American whiskey was still like a big thing, and it was still kind of like quite rye heavy stuff that we were using. And it was just a really fun time doing that. And obviously coming back to the UK and suddenly being inundated with, it's basically like a kid in a candy shop. It's like, I love all this whiskey, and suddenly I can get it. Yeah, being able to do that. And then when I left the UK, rye was still, it was Sazerac and Rittenhouse, and that was it. Like, you didn't really, maybe Pikesville, the old Pikesville you got, but coming back, quite available to us. And like, rye was this big category that people were kind of getting on board with. And I remember chatting to a bartender, basically being like, well, rye whiskey is really big now, because you've got a generation of people whose parents didn't drink it, but their grandparents did. So it's kind of that cool factor where the grandparents drank rye whiskey in the States, and so the parents didn't, because that's what your parents drank. So then they moved back to rye. So it's like skipped a generation, as it were. And that was just like a really interesting thing. And then it was just like all these things that were coming in. It was quite a nice kind of experience to kind of actually start making kind of classic cocktails with rye whiskey that wasn't previously kind of like available. It wasn't like a readily available product until I'd say fairly recently in the UK, in the last 5-6 years at least.
With the whiskey in Malta, there was a time when we had so we had the cast of 13 Hours. They were filming in Malta, and they came into our bar every single night, and they loved American whiskey, right? They were obsessed with it. So we were smashing through, Willett and E.H. Taylor and stuff with them every night. But Will, bless, he had to literally trawl around Malta. He'd bus between, and it was the summer as well. You're talking like 40 degrees heat with like 89% humidity. And so Will's like every day trekking across the island, going into all these bottle shops and bars, trying to find more bourbon to sell to these guys. It was amazing. It was so good.
I did find one, and it was, and I've still got one bottle left from that little trek, which was I've still got it here. So I managed to find this guy. So
was that the 8-year-old?
That's the Wild Turkey 8-year-old.
Yeah.
So it's about 10 bottles in this one bottle shop. I was like, I'll take them, just all of them, give them to me, because like I've got these guys and they want it, and I've got to provide it. And it was such a weird sort of concept of being in, especially bartending, of just wanting that product and then not having access to it, and not in the same way, like kind of bitters. And was like, oh, okay, cool. Like I guess I can go back to basics and try and make this, and simply I can't. Like it was a weird concept, but the island itself loves whiskey. Yeah. They've got some amazing. Like, they get because a lot of the products are done on allocation. They get some really high end stuff, and it's really obscure. It's like for whiskey, I'd say like it's a really cool adventure to go to that country. It shouldn't work, but it does. So I guess that was one of like my biggest sort of exposure to whiskey, of trying to do that, and then still to this day, just got memories of staying up to like 6-7 in the morning writing whiskey descriptions, and be like, I guess that's all right, and being like 10 descriptions in and pretty sloshed.
Well, I guess I mean I've made an incredibly crude attempt to just kind of explain whiskey then to someone that might.
I mean, like that's. I'll be honest. Like I think that. So I'm like with all that sort of like behind me. Like I don't think I've ever been able to like what you said, where it's just like it's essentially an oak aged grain spirit. I think it's such a nice, small, concise way to say it.
Yeah.
Because it kind of like it captures you, like, well, actually, no, yeah, like it is in essence, that's it, and then you can go a little bit further and start picking it into different bits.
Like say though, the more you pick at it, the more it starts. I mean, there's going to be about, God forbid, if that description kind of goes out in full, that there's going to be about 1,000 whiskey purists at my throat. Like, whoa, no, I don't think that's exactly. It's true. It gets very hard. It's very hard to describe it without getting technical. But it is quite interesting if you smell an oak barrel that has never seen whiskey in its life. If you just stick your face in there and have a sniff, then you'll say to yourself, that smells like whiskey, but it's not. It's actually oak, and it's all the flavor compounds that are in oak that are this huge influence on how whiskey tastes. But the things you need to focus on are what grain is it made from, where is it from, and how long is it aged for, and what's it aged in, and you'll have a good idea from there. But it is an incredibly vast category, which is probably the reason that I fell in love with it, to be honest. I started researching it. Maybe I was bartending from when I was like, in a very small way, from when I was like 15. I was probably about 21, 22 when I started getting interested in whiskey, and it was just impossible to not keep learning. I still today I read stuff and it just blows previous preconceptions about what whiskey is out of the water, and how different everything is. There's amazing stuff out there. We're really spoiled. Even a lot of the whiskeys that people overlook are actually amazing and incredibly well made today. So there's so much to learn, and you can taste one thing one day. I had an interesting thing the other day. I had two whiskies. You could both say they're from Ireland. You could both say that they were from ex-American whiskey and ex-sherry barrel. You could both say that they were between 7 and 12 years old. And you could say that they were made from the same grains as well and exactly the same mash bill. Now, you could explain all that to a customer and it's almost already too complicated, yeah? But these two whiskies tasted completely different. So it's that kind of thing where you know, almost everything can be the same, but it's the nuance that's going to create some of the most interesting differences as well. So yeah, I mean, it's so hard to pinpoint what your relationship with whiskey is because it's almost so hard to, as I demonstrated, explain what whiskey is sometimes.
Well, it's such a huge category as well, and there's so many subcategories within it.
Yeah, for sure. I think we're
and I think one of the biggest misconceptions people think is that a good whiskey has to be single malt, and I think they are missing out if they're not trying blended whiskies. They are missing out on such an amazing experience, and there's so many great blended whiskies out there.
For sure.
Yeah, don't limit.
And aging as well. Age statements being incredibly important. This is 50 years old. That's the reason it costs £1,500. It's, you know, because the guarantee of quality is not there with a high age statement. What is a guarantee is that this is going to be a very unique experience because it's taken a lot of effort to get that whiskey to where it is. Lots of people probably just don't like heavily aged whiskey. You know, it does have a very distinct flavor. It's had a lot of time to interact with wood. It's going to taste a lot like that wood. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to like it. You know, all too often I have someone ask me and say, you know, Tom, I don't know much about whiskey. What would you suggest I get for my dad? And I'll say, you know, how much whiskey does he drink? And he's like, oh, you know, he's not that interested. I'm like, well, get him this. And they'll say, oh, but I was hoping to get something good, you know, something more expensive. And it's like, well, this is good and it's not expensive and it's not going to be something that's too challenging as well. So we need to get out of the mindset of this is good whiskey because whether that thing is price or whether that thing is age or whether that thing is statement, i.e. single malt or, you know, all these other classic definitions and things like that. All whiskies can be good. It's just, you know, it depends on what
there's definitely, you know, something can be overaged. I was given a purposely overaged whiskey once just so that I could, you know, so that we could try and see what it's like. Oh my God, it's just like sawdust and older
you go to
better.
Especially places in hotter climates. You know, if you're in a hotter climate, if it's an older whiskey, you're playing with fire a little bit because, you know, you're going to lose a really high percentage of that whiskey every year to evaporation, and that means you're concentrating down. So you go past a certain age limit and you're going to just have something that's very concentrated and has got a lot of the flavor compounds from the wood seeded out into the, you know, specifically wood sugars. It's not always good. It's not always good. I just think I would implore anyone who is starting to fall in love with whiskey to just really go into it with an open mind. You know, things will come massively surprise you. You know, like I say, rye does not have to be dry and spicy. You know, Scottish whiskey for sure doesn't have to be smoky. That's a really common prevalent one, is that Scottish whiskey is going to be smoky. It's not. It's
actually a really small percentage of it that is smoky.
It's a very specific production method. You know, there are going to be, you know, similarities between whiskies that are made in the same way, but like I say, you could get into as much detail as anyone could handle, and you still won't get to the root of why something tastes amazing or something tastes different and things like that. So
we've got 4 minutes left, guys, just to let you know.
I think we can wrap this one up, to be honest.
I would say so.
I guess I would like to say huge shout out to Drink With Us. Just, you know, amazing content, and I'm really happy to contribute in just absolutely any way. And anyone watching, thank you so much for your time and for your attention. It has been wonderful to sit and shoot the shit like we always do, if you know what I mean, in a very virtual saying. But no, just thank you guys so much.
Thank
Thank you for
It's been a-
joining me and everything as well. And Will, amazing beverage. You know,
I've drank
guys,
mine, so I'm just on the whiskey.
Yeah, I'm
nearly drank this now as well. Tom, thank you for coming on and chatting to us.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you for spending time, and actually genuine. Like, although like I've been doing it 10 years, like still learning stuff and still learning stuff, which is nice, and that's a nice thing to have. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, it's a wonderful bartending everything. Just enjoying this stuff. It's so generative. We've talked about, you know, the next generation of bartenders and people and things we want to see, things that are happening and going forward, and just like nurturing those things is just a real trip as well. And and like you say, you never know enough. You know, you talk about these things and someone will always say something, you'll be like, you know what, I never even thought about that. And it's about being open to like the new information as well, and everything that makes it so exciting. But just getting to sit and talk with people like yourselves and everything as well. So it is wonderful. And huge shout out to Gander Media as well,
thanks,
for putting these videos together. But thank you very much, and hopefully you get to make your own syrups at home and stuff, and your own cocktails, and look forward to doing another one of these soon.
Cool. I'm gonna sign us out of this, and looking forward to real hugs sometime in the future.
Real hugs,
someday.
Nice one. Hi, guys.
Okay.
Have a good.
Love you guys. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.